Oh yay, oh yay, oh yay, oh yay, oh yay.
Willkommen, bienvenue, welcome. No, this is not cabaret, it's Think About It, a podcast about the power of ideas and how language can change the world, with Uli Baer. What are the philosophical underpinnings of free speech? Professor J. Wallace of the University of California at Berkeley's Department of Philosophy served on the Chancellor's Commission for Free Speech. He thought hard and long and consulted many people to come up with some guidelines of how universities can do better. Thank you. Today I'm here with Jay Wallace, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of California at Berkeley. You're also the Judy Chandler Webb Distinguished Chair of Innovative Teaching and Research, correct?
Yes, that's right.
So we're sitting in Moses Hall here, which I presume is not named after a biblical figure, but I don't know.
No, it's not. It's named after, I think, a professor of political science at the university,
Right.
who actually has some, from the contemporary perspective, questionable associations with imperialism.
Oh, really?
Looking back,
So it's one of those names that maybe will be changed in the future or debated. Okay.
Yeah, it's possible. Yes.
And today is a big day at Berkeley, so it's move-in day
Yeah.
for about 7,500 new students, freshmen. I actually just dropped off my own son in a dorm. So it's quite an exciting day, and having about 7,000 new students, they are all aware. I think most of them have gone to high school, maybe few are transferring in from later stages in life. They know that their debates about free speech. They are on social media. They're
Yes.
definitely exposed to all sorts of opinions.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people want to get to the minds of these 7,500 people, right? Not just to
Right.
shape them to develop their own ideas, but also to influence them and give them something to think about, and maybe also sort of, let's say, what we wouldn't do in the university, make them think the way we think. So as a philosophy professor, how would you start a conversation to not 7,500, but to freshmen coming to Berkeley who've been aware of these debates, have been aware of what happened over the last year, and we'll get to your role sort of in sort of helping the university think through it. But how would you start a conversation with 18-year-olds who know there's a big challenge?
Yeah.
And you're going to be in the middle of it. So I
Right.
walked through Sproul Plaza. They're all walking through there right now,
Yes.
and they know that this was the site of these controversies a year ago.
Yeah. No, it's a really good question. I think the free speech environment for the current generation of college students is completely different from what it was for the generation back in the 60s and 70s and the heyday of the free speech movement at Berkeley. I mean, social media and the availability of unlimited, costless speech online creates a completely different context for thinking about free speech and thinking about its purpose and rationale and justification and effects in some ways, and our students are very savvy about that. It's an interesting feature of the contemporary kind of environment they're growing up in, that it gives the lie to some of the traditional liberal pieties about free speech. I mean, the idea that the best way to counter questionable speech is with more speech.
Which is probably a piety that everybody would like to share, not just liberals. We would all,
Exactly.
conservative or liberal, like to believe
But
that.
you look what goes on online or in the comment section, the unmoderated comment sections on newspapers and so on, and it's just a kind of cesspool of invective and disinformation, and it's not at all obvious that more speech is always better speech, or that more speech is conducive to discovery of the truth.
And this would be one thing they're coming to the university for, to actually, for example, learn how to discover the truth or respect facts or knowledge. And
I think so, yeah. I think that's one of the interesting things for these students. They come into the university from a context where they're bombarded with unlimited free speech online and on social media. And my own sense with some of my students is that they have a particularly keen appreciation for the kind of curated context of debate and discussion that a university represents, right?
that's what they're looking for.
That's what.
presumably.
Well, they can see that there's value that you get from a speech context which is curated and so on. I mean, that's what our classrooms are. They're not First Amendment zones. You're not allowed to just say anything. Professor and the graduate student instructors heavily moderate the discussion, but in order to keep things on track and to ensure that we have an open debate that is really focused and conducive to discovery and truth and so on.
So there's a goal, and the students know that. They're enrolling here, they applied really, really, competitive school to get in.
Yeah.
To be in a classroom where not just anybody can go off on any topic, but if you're teaching philosophy and I want to come in and discuss the NBA or fantasy football, you're going to tell me this is not the space to do it.
This is not the place to do that.
And I cannot invoke the First Amendment. So that's what they want. That's one of the main roles of the university, right? To sort of say this is what you call curated, which we would call curated for a good purpose, right? This is the mission and the intent of the university. And can we talk a little bit about the conditions for that situation, which would be different from Sproul Plaza, from the open areas, but in a classroom you want to create some conditions for conversations. And if I come up with a fantasy football metaphor in your philosophy class, you can let me go on for a sentence or two, because maybe I can turn this into a useful example. You're going to be skeptical probably. I'm not a trained philosopher, but but after 3 sentences you're going to stop me and say this is really
if it's not going anywhere, I'm going to say, look, you're wasting it.
And where's it supposed to go? Exactly. Where's it supposed to go? If I say, well, no, Professor Wallace, I want to explain something to you that you don't even know yet. It's a brand new idea. I'm increasing the viewpoint diversity here.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, it's got to be focused to engage with the subject matter that's under discussion in the course, and it's got to, reflect some basic familiarity with the text and the issues that we're discussing and the issues that are the focus in some sense. So, one thing you're looking for when you're trying to moderate one of these discussions as an instructor is just to make sure it's on track. It doesn't reflect basic ignorance of the text that's under discussion. It's going to be, it has at least a chance of being a constructive contribution to.
And how open-ended is this? If it's a search for probably not the truth with a capital T, the one absolute truth, but it's directed in a way.
It's directed, sure, that's right. I think in philosophy there is no single truth that we're looking for. We're looking for thoughtful perspectives on the issues that are, at the center of our investigation. I think some of the views that people express are more plausible than others, but it's a different kind of inquiry from in some other parts of the university.
So if we use the classroom setting as a kind of example, how speech is productively regulated or curated for a purpose, we're not saying it's not infringing anybody's rights, it's not even a legal conversation, to say the conditions are it should contribute to a general understanding that this example or these facts or this material or this argument will contribute. It's based on something. I didn't just make it up. There are also other conditions. When people come into your classroom, how do you treat them to actually participate in this conversation?
Right. You're right. There are other conditions. It's kind of basic ground rule that we want to foster not just constructive but also respectful debate that doesn't deliberately try to exclude members of our classroom communities from participating in discussion. So invective, ad hominem, derogatory comments just have no place in the classroom.
Right. If we don't get to even this kind of language yet, invective, which probably most reasonable people would say, of course, I couldn't call anybody a name, but if I said, well, I know what you're saying, but as you belong to a group that really doesn't have that much sort of to contribute to this kind of topic. So an assumption that had been, kind of standard doctrine in Western thought that women don't have the capacity for abstract reasoning. You cannot do that in a classroom, right? I couldn't say, so you are a female student and you really not, you shouldn't contribute at this moment because of group belonging. This condition in the university, it's an assumption that everybody makes walking into a classroom.
It is, absolutely, and it reflects one of the values around which the contemporary university is organized, which is a commitment to respectful but inclusive discourse that takes seriously each of the participants. And is open to assessing them based on the merits of the what they say rather than the perspective from which they say.
So if the terms are respectful, inclusive, would you go so far that equality is a category that one can use here, which is and in your work I read your article on hypocrisy, which I was quite interested in, because you make an assumption and you say in this philosophical argument about hypocrisy that actually you have to treat people and consider that they have equal social standing. That's a condition that, in some ways, you say that it's otherwise moral philosophy doesn't work at all. If you don't make that assumption.
It's a basic kind of condition of morality.
It's a basic condition of morality
itself.
Kind
of what morality is about, is doing justice to the fact that each of us is, equally important. Our interests matter equally in some sense, and that has some expression in the classroom as well. Having said that, the classroom is a special context. And, academics are constantly making discriminations between students,
Right.
Which don't involve, treating them equally in terms of the outcomes of assessment exercises and things like that. They're judging who has the better arguments, who writes the most
Right.
effective paper, and so on.
I think this is an important thing to parse for a moment, to say there's an
Yes.
assumption of equality, meaning
Yes.
everybody walks into the room and you
Yeah.
have the right of equal participation regardless of who you are, what your background is,
Yeah.
etc. But nonetheless, it's a competitive environment where your
Mhm.
opinion may matter more, may be considered more correct, more valuable, and
Mhm.
therefore it will actually trump or outdo another argument. So there's a kind of
Yeah.
a principle of equality at work, which does not mean there's sameness.
Exactly, yes, that's right. There's still discrimination, but you're right. Everyone should have an equal chance to contribute to the discussion and to participate and to make their perspective heard, or
Right.
to make their argument if we're having an informal discussion. With the proviso that if it's not going anywhere or proves to be not to the point,
Right.
or based on lack of familiarity with the text that everyone else is discussing, then they're going to be cut off at a certain point.
Right.
Politely, I hope. But
And on the merits of the argument,
on the
and
merits
not
of the
on who
argument,
they
absolutely.
are.
It's
And-
not a question about who they are.
And if we go back to say, you said you make equality into a kind of precondition or a kind of non-negotiable
Yeah.
condition of moral philosophy. You say
Yeah.
without that it doesn't really make sense to do moral philosophy. I mean, you could do it probably, right? You do moral philosophy only for some people.
You could, but
You couldn't call it moral philosophy.
I do think the kind of a late modern conception of morality
Yeah.
is a set of requirements that reflect the fact that we inhabit a world with other people whose interests.
Right. A pluralistic
Are-
world which is complicated.
Yeah, that's right. It's complicated, but everyone's interests matter equally.
Right.
And that makes some demands on
Right.
us that we have to take seriously in our deliberations about what to do.
Why I'm asking about this term
Yes.
equality so much, which is different from respect,
Yeah.
kind of, or treating people, respectfully and recognition of their dignities, because equality happens to be a legal concept for the
Yes.
university as well. It's mandated by law.
Yeah.
It's not we can choose to run universities that
Right.
receive federal funding and not treat people equally.
Yes.
While the university, as we said, have the right to discriminate based on what people say.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the right answer.
Yeah.
You're not going to say it again. You're going to get a low grade or even
Yeah.
fail and all that. There are sorts of
Right.
considerations or consequences. So equality is a legal concept, and equality is also, I think, touches on the political debates about free speech, in my
Mhm.
view.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm actually quite interested in where the argument about equality enters, because a lot of the conversations that have been had across the country are about students, about their feelings, about
Yes.
being sensitive, about being offended,
Yeah.
about not tolerating some viewpoint.
Yeah.
All of that language to me, and I'm curious as a philosopher,
Mhm.
where we put that language sounds to me is a language of psychology, of emotions, of
Mhm.
affect.
Mm-hmm.
Equality is not that language.
Yeah. Yeah.
So and you were part of the Commission on Free Speech for the University of California. You co-chaired it actually.
Yes.
It's a really, really, really powerful report. I read the report. You issued some kind of recommendations how universities could navigate this complicated space.
Yeah.
Equality doesn't come up there. It's actually
Yes.
about tolerance and about sort of difficult speech and counter speech and all that. I'm kind of curious if this classroom conversation we just had
Yes.
has a bearing on the larger university.
I think it does have a bearing, though I wouldn't have put it in terms of equality myself, but
Yeah.
I think that's still a helpful rubric and an important value to bring to bear to reflections about free speech and what a free speech regime looks like within the broader context of a university community. I mean, you connected legal questions of equality with these kind of psychologizing
Right.
terms that people use to characterize some of the effects of hateful
Right.
speech and invective of the sort that characterizes a lot of the most controversial contemporary political discourse and so on. I think you have a point that I think a lot of people are concerned that speech, especially reflecting on the First Amendment absolutism in the United States and the idea that hate speech is protected speech under the First Amendment. A lot of people are rightly concerned that speech is a kind of action and intervention, causal intervention in the world that does have effects on other people, and they tend to theorize those effects in terms of hurt feelings or
Right.
causing offense to people
Right.
or causing them distress or discomfort
Right.
or offense or things like that. And there's a way, cycling back to your concerns about that way of talking about the effects of derogatory speech, I think doesn't fully characterize its effects within a democratic political context. I mean, I think your NYU colleague Jeremy Waldron has written interestingly about the harm and hate speech.
I have a podcast with him. Exactly. Yes. Right.
Yeah.
So he says
he's very articulate about these
speech
issues.
which demeans people and
Right.
degrades them, and actually has, we have a historical knowledge that this speech has certain effects. And then he says something where, let's say, in the context of specific spaces, let's say workplace or
Yes.
university, it actually impedes, for example, participation on full, on equal terms.
Right.
So then he takes it from this kind of
Yeah.
this, let's say, not just emotional harm, but actually it's demeaning and degrading and touches on what he calls dignity, which
Yeah.
is not a legal concept, more philosophical
Right.
in our kind of jurisprudence. And then he says, but that creates unequal conditions.
Yes.
If you are continually subjected to
Right.
being called names, etc., or to be subjected to derogatory language, which
Yeah.
is targeted specifically at you as a member of a minority group, he says that has an impact on the equality clause, on the equality guarantees.
Yeah.
And what's interesting, is what you're saying is this transition maybe doesn't quite capture all of the dimensions. I think it's one argument that's out there
Yeah.
that people have made.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other arguments.
Yeah.
And the great thing I think about the students is, you're going to have 7,500 students, hopefully 7,500
Right.
opinions. They're not going to have one opinion.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're going to have strong opinions, though.
They're going to have strong opinions, that's right, yeah. But, I mean, to come back to Waldron, I am sympathetic to his point that, there's a specific kind of harm associated with hate speech and invective that I think is particularly significant because of its effects on excluding and denying the equal standing of members of complicated modern communities. When we come back to we didn't emphasize that issue or issues about offense or other forms of
Right.
harm that speech could create in its listeners in the report of the Free Speech Commission. That it was a commission that was constituted by the Chancellor in the wake of the events on the Berkeley campus last fall and the preceding winter that mostly involved these kind of conservative performance artists, Milo Yiannopoulos and Ann Coulter. There was an abortive attempt by Milo to speak on campus,
Right.
and I think it was the winter of 2017 that resulted in riots that were mostly provoked by not by Berkeley students, but
Right.
by off-campus agitators. And then Milo announced a return to the campus last fall, and the Chancellor thought it was particularly important to just make sure that the event could go forward without disruption, and it did go forward sort of without disruption. It kind of petered out because it turned out to be just a publicity stunt on Milo's part. But it cost the campus, the security part of it cost the campus millions of dollars, $4 million or something.
Wow.
And it cost, and it disrupted the campus massively. And this was all just to protect kind of Milo Yiannopoulos, it's not obvious that he has anything interesting to say.
I was going to say, you were going to say, this
Yeah.
was all just to protect the First Amendment.
Yeah.
Which your colleague, Erwin
Yeah.
Chemerinsky and Howard
Yeah.
Gilman, who
Yeah.
I'm also going to have on the podcast, have said this is defending the First Amendment, which
Yeah.
most people would say, we did not spend $4 million to defend anything this man
No,
stands
of
for
course not.
or this woman stands for.
Yeah.
We defended a principle.
Yeah.
I think the question then is, and I had coffee this morning at the Mario Savio
Oh, yeah.
Freedom
Yes.
of Speech movement
Mhm.
coffee shop on the
Yeah.
Berkeley campus. These people are using a free speech rhetoric and mantle to advance an agenda that is really not in keeping
Yeah.
with what Savio did, which
Right.
who was a freedom writer who was
Yeah, of
registering
course.
voters in the South in the early 1960s. They're advancing an agenda that has nothing to do with equality.
Yeah.
I really think that's kind of a fair summary of their points of view. When you
Yeah.
try to read a page of Ann Coulter or Milo, that's not
Yeah.
their agenda.
Yeah.
But they're using this First Amendment argument. So in some ways, when the university is
Yeah.
caught in this,
Yes.
defending an abstract principle,
Yep.
and it has to convince its students, we're defending this principle, but we have nothing to do with this message. We're actually really against this message. And
Yeah.
in your report, you try to kind of strike a balance.
Yes.
How do you think the university can convince its members that we have an abstract principle here we support
Mhm.
at all cost, but at the same time we really have very other values which actually
Yeah.
are what could be called the language of inclusion,
Yeah.
could be called the language of equality,
Right.
language of respect,
Yeah.
language of actually we respect the truth,
Yeah.
we respect facts.
Yes.
These people, as you said, they cast aspersions on higher education, or they actually don't even believe in higher education. They want to disrupt the university.
In some sense, they're trying to discredit universities.
That's
Their
right.
agenda
So
is
the
to
university is inviting in someone who
Yeah.
may actually want to discredit the power of the university to decide what merits debate.
Right. Yeah.
So that's a great kind of, that actually it could be called hypocritical.
It certainly could be, yeah.
In your
not that it would
characterization,
matter,
it would be
yes.
interesting if
Yeah.
these people are contradicting themselves.
Yeah.
Who cares?
Yeah.
We don't really
Right,
care about that.
right.
But it doesn't matter when it affects other people,
Yeah.
when they're dragging
Yeah.
the university
That's right.
into it. So
Yeah.
the university now is turned into something that's inconsistent
Yes.
with itself.
Yeah. No, I think that's what is interesting and challenging about these free speech issues. You know, where we were operating in a constraint where, you know, American jurisprudence sees public universities as First Amendment zones.
Right.
You know, going back to regulating or prohibiting hate speech, I think that was just kind of a non-starter for our commission.
Right.
Even if philosophically not all of us are convinced that the First Amendment is the only way of implementing a free speech regime in a liberal society. I spent a lot of time in Germany, and you come from Germany.
You know, or if we could say, you know, we have a very, very powerful tradition of dissent on the court.
Yeah.
So in some ways, one doesn't even have to go to Canada or Germany or France.
Yeah.
One can say there is a very robust dissenting tradition on the court,
Yeah.
and the court, you know, and Sullivan decides that
Yeah.
hate speech will be regulated. It leaves other
Yeah.
cases. Bohane is kind of left open. There are other
Yeah.
cases about, you know,
Yeah.
group invective. So in some ways, one could say America has always struggled with this.
Yeah.
The current interpretation of the First Amendment is the current interpretation.
Yeah.
If we were somewhere else, people would not say the First Amendment is the best thing we have. They would say this is the wrong interpretation of
Right.
it. So I think that's what's changed in this
Mhm.
year,
Mhm.
that now people are looking at it and saying, oh, there's a way to interpret the First Amendment in a very simplistic way.
Right.
Or
Yeah.
I'm being dragged into a corner here that I
Yeah.
didn't really mean to defend.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm an absolutist, but this
Yeah.
is not what I thought absolutism
Right.
means.
Right. Yeah.
So,
Well, I think there is scope to push back on the kind of absolutist interpretation of the First Amendment. Not everyone would want to do that. Erwin Chemerinsky was a member of our commission,
Right.
and he certainly wouldn't want to go in that direction. But, you know, kind of from a pragmatic political standpoint, Berkeley, it's both the campus of the free speech movement, but it's also perceived as a very liberal place. If we do anything that's going to be perceived as weakening our commitment to the First Amendment and to
you'll have the
free speech.
ACLU suing you right away.
Exactly, and
Our friends at the ACLU will immediately take up the
I'm
cause.
not sure that's really where we want to go in the contemporary debate. But one thing we thought we could make some recommendations toward would be to encourage members of our community just to be more thoughtful. I come back to the idea of a curated speech community. Inviting speakers outside of the classroom to talk to people in Sproul Plaza or in one of the student activity spaces or something like that. Those are not classroom activities, but they're still taking place on our campus. And, you know, it seems to me people should be, as members of our community, thoughtful about what kind of speech we want to sponsor within the confines of the campus as contributions to valuable debate within the larger university community.
And you were careful to say you recommending that student groups actually explain why they're inviting somebody without making that into a condition where
Exactly,
someone
yes.
can overrule it
Yeah.
and say you can invite them.
Right. So I think this is as far as the issues we were looking at are concerned, this was the kind of interesting note is that, you know, professors make decisions all the time about who gets invited to campus, and they have a lot of authority in doing that. And they're typically responsible about exercising that authority. We invite philosophers to give talks in our colloquium series, and our students rely on us to exercise judgment, and, you know, inviting reputable people who are going to have interesting things to contribute. The campus, in a sense, and this is a kind of extension of the results of the free speech movement, which was all about the ability of members of the community to engage in political speech on the campus, including students. And it's kind of an extension of that. Students, insofar as they're members of registered organizations, are authorized by the campus to extend invitations to outsiders on behalf of the campus. And that has really been the kind of node of controversy. The controversial speakers that we've had in recent years were officially sponsored by registered student organizations. And in some sense, we think it's important that our students should have the authority and have some freedom to, as an extension of their own political speech rights, to invite outside people to come to campus to engage in debate. But I think they also have responsibilities as members of a community in extending those invitations to select people who have something to say that's going to be a constructive contribution to debate within an intellectual community. And they should give some thought about how they want to sponsor these events consistently with our principles of community.
How do you think the fact that this has gotten so expensive
Yeah.
is shaping this? Because in some ways, when I think about that the cost can escalate to millions
Yeah.
of dollars, I think it's not good for a public university to spend its money on there. You could
No.
have $700,000, you could have 52 students from the Bay Area attend Berkeley for a
Of
year
course,
on those
yes.
scholarships. I looked it
Yeah.
up. So that's actually a lot of students who would really benefit, probably, you would
Absolutely,
think.
yeah.
And the university, in all of its materials, has this kind of value to say we want
Yeah.
to make this education available to as many people who are qualified as we can. But in some ways, I think the money really muddies this conversation, not in the best way, because then people are suddenly saying, why are you spending this money on behalf of a principal, but you have other principles. It doesn't help, I think, actually, in a way. I actually think maybe it's a way for the public to become aware of it, because money talks louder than other things, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's a very difficult issue about how to manage. I think everyone on the commission thought it was ridiculous that we had to spend that much money.
And this seemed to be an unresolved issue a little bit from the report. Seems to be people were not totally clear what to make or what kind of recommendation to issue here.
Yeah.
So you apply to the university, or apply to the governor, I don't know, of California or the state, or
Well, it's a tricky thing. I mean, I think no one in the commission thought that it would be unreasonable to set a limit, an annual limit on what the campus is willing to spend to defend the First Amendment,
right.
as it were. You know, given that resources are limited, and
Right.
as you say, there are many other valuable purposes that
And
these
people would
resources-
say defend the First Amendment with the exemptions that are in place.
Yeah.
Because no one could come here and defame people,
Yeah.
could spread low value speech,
Right.
promote child pornography,
Yeah.
obscenity.
Yeah.
All sorts of things are regulated.
Yeah.
Everybody knows they're regulated, but no one has a problem. So in some ways,
Yeah.
these extreme examples are useful. No one would say you could spend
Right.
$700,000 to bring a child pornographer to campus.
Yeah.
There are very few people in the country who would really say my absolutism goes this
Right.
far. They say
Right.
I recognize
Yeah.
there's some need to regulate.
Yes.
But so after this, so you spend a lot of time with members of the community listening to what their
Mhm.
perceptions were. How do you see this in the larger context of we live in a different country than we did 5 years ago, and we
Yeah.
did, in 1964. So in some ways,
Sure.
I think obviously the Berkeley controversies resonate with the political
Yes.
culture of our country.
Yeah.
And every single time there's something
Yep.
that ignites into a kind of, not just because of
Yep.
social media, but because
Right.
of the
Well, the more immediate political environment, yeah. It's interesting, yeah, I think there are a couple of aspects of that I would highlight. You know, I think one just is the fact that, you know, universities are in some sense under attack. There's a kind of orchestrated campaign to discredit them in the public eye. There's a kind of facile narrative about them as being communities of intolerance.
elitism,
And
that expertise
elitism.
is elitist,
That's right.
that
I think
knowledge
that's
is
right.
actually a bunch of
Right.
detached
Yeah.
ivory tower,
Right.
liberals who are
Yeah.
lording it over the rest of the country. There's a
I think
kind
that's
of
right.
attack on,
Yeah.
and that is
That's,
is there any truth to that? That there's a kind of intolerance in universities?
Well, I was going to say the other aspect of it is I think that is a sense that universities and places like Berkeley in particular, NYU is probably not much different, are not particularly hospitable to conservative,
Yeah, in terms of numerically,
Political
probably not, right?
Yeah.
I'm
The
sure we have generally tend to have more liberal-leaning faculty and liberal-leaning
Yeah.
students. A big question is that because liberals go into academia, or
Yeah.
because people who study a lot tend to become liberal?
Yeah.
I can't answer
Yeah.
that question.
Right. I mean, but some of the exchanges I had with conservatives, there was a kind of a back and forth I had with Megan McArdle, who wrote a blog post about our commission's report, and it was kind of interesting to me because as we went back and forth, she was very critical of the report, but she actually didn't criticize any of our recommendations because in fact there was nothing to criticize. We basically were vigorously defending the rights of conservative and other student groups to invite anyone they want, and the responsibility of the campus to defend the First Amendment. But she objected to the tone. We started out the report by criticizing Milo and Ann Coulter, and as I went back and forth with her about it, increasingly it became clear to me that what she objected to was that we weren't being, as a commission, sufficiently respectful of, as she thought of it, the sensibilities and the viewpoint of conservative members of our community. And she actually, she actually, accused us committing microaggressions. I thought this was kind of hilarious against conservative members of the community, given.
I mean, this is actually, I think this is where we are now, political culture, that a term will be used against its intended, purpose within minutes.
Yeah.
That now, the greatest snowflakes are found on the right.
Yes.
It is instantly a microaggression if you actually call somebody out. If you actually say, we don't respect someone's point of view, it's intolerant, you're not respecting the First Amendment, and you think, how do we get out of this kind of complete seesaw of as soon as you could criticize me, I'm going to turn this against you.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that you got sort of criticized for saying you're intolerant and.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we were doing in the report, we were defending the free speech rights of our students, but we were going to exercise our own free speech rights to criticize, some of the decisions to invite Ann Coulter or Milo Yiannopoulos to campus as not very responsible on the part of our students because they don't have anything valuable to say.
And you think as university faculty and students and members of the community, it is your right to say what is valuable
absolutely.
speech?
I think that's part. I come back to this issue of the curated speech environment, and rather than thinking in terms of harm necessarily or offense, I think we should think more about the value of speech within a university context. And our students have tremendous authority invested in them to invite outsiders to come to campus. But they should be making judgments for themselves about what people are going to be able to say something to members of campus that will be a valuable contribution.
And I presume you've been chair of a philosophy department. If you'd hired somebody and they're really unqualified, truly unqualified, you actually you would not get support, and you should actually not be able to run a department if you hire and appoint teachers who are not qualified, which would be low value speech. It would be speech.
Right.
Some people would even consider it maybe very important, conspiracy theories, who knows what, but in some ways, the category of that it has a value, our legal system recognizes low value speech in a very specific way.
Sure.
It's very narrow, it really is very, very narrow, but it does exist, and there's speech that has no value.
Yeah.
Universities actually, their entire business is to say speech has value.
That's what I'm saying, yes.
And some speech has more value than others.
And we want robust contributions from a massively wide range of perspectives, but that should be genuine contributions to debate and discussion on campus.
How did your debate end up with this blogger where you're engaging and you're not tolerant enough of conservative students? And I see what the point is to say. Very liberal universities, maybe the students don't feel they get a lot of hearing. They can sit on Sproul Plaza, can stand there, say.
But they're definitely in the minority,
and that seems to be a really difficult experience for them.
Yeah.
Which is the experience of many people in this country all the time.
Yeah.
So in some ways, there's something to me when they become very vocal, say, we're the minority here, and you say, I can tell you who the minorities are in many, many other ways in every university in America.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's interesting that this experience of being a minority results immediately in a complaint, in a kind of outraged complaint, you're treating me unfairly.
Right. And I think it's a real problem. And in some sense, I think a lot of the conservative complaints about the modern university are, people talk about, conservative identity politics, but they're not represented significantly in the context of the contemporary university. I think this is a complex problem. I don't think it's because of prejudice just on the part of modern academia. I do think the Republican Party, as it's moved more and more into an extreme direction, has maneuvered itself outside of the extent to which it's hitched its wagon to the climate change denialism. There are vast spectrum parts of our campus in the engineering faculty and the natural sciences faculty. The engineering faculty is filled with entrepreneurs who start up their own companies. They're not hostile to, they're not wild-eyed leftists who are hostile to, capitalism. A lot of them, I think, are kind of natural kind of centrists who would, probably align with the Republican Party in a different era. But if you're an academic in the contemporary world and the Republican Party is denying human contribution to climate change, you've kind of maneuvered yourself outside of the domain of kind of scholarly fact-based discourse. And
it's quite interesting that you bring that in, because I think the discussion about how the university establishes value in speech hasn't involved the natural sciences quite as much.
Yeah.
And there's been the March on Science, and there's been some questions of whether the president has appointed a science advisor or not, which he hasn't. and sort of that scientists
I think he did recently, but only
very
after-
recently. Yeah, it's actually a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, just a couple of
But
weeks
there's not a connection made between inviting a very incendiary conservative political speaker who promotes all sorts of nonsense
Yeah.
about, racial groups.
Yeah.
But inviting somebody who denies obvious science in some ways that wouldn't really fly necessarily,
Right.
but they don't see a connection there.
Yeah.
And I think what you said earlier, that there's a kind of deep suspicion of the university.
Yeah.
I think that is the underlying theme of these speech debates. I actually
Yeah,
don't
I
think
think
the
that's
speech
right.
debates are about a bunch of 18-year-old sensitive snowflakes.
No,
I actually think
no, I don't think they are. No.
it's about the authority of people to
Mhm.
decide that some things are actually established and settled.
Yeah.
And we have to operate on that assumption.
Yeah.
We can't just reinvest and open that debate up.
Yeah, I think there's that's certainly kind of undercurrent to these debates. That's very important. But anyway, a single campus can only do so much in the broader cultural
How do you think this is
context.
going to play out? Do you anticipate that, sort of the Commission's report for the University of California may become a standard for some other universities? You said in this report, and I was very intrigued, you said the chancellor or whoever the provost or president of a campus should probably choose to articulate the university's value when someone comes who really
Yeah.
disagrees with those values. This, to me, is a very important part of the kind of free
Yes.
speech absolutism. If you believe absolutely in the First Amendment, then you should make sure you don't get confused with defending the speaker's point
Yes.
of view.
Yes.
And I actually thought at that point you would have pushed a little more and said, if the university has an extremist on campus, the universities should actually say something else, not just as a choice, maybe we'll really disagree with it, but actually to convince its students to say, we're not doing this actually to demean you.
Yeah.
We're doing this to respect the law.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this is a kind of
Yeah.
more philosophical line than a legal line.
Yeah. Well, I think that's in the spirit of our recommendations. They were that the campus should, when if one of our student groups does invite someone whose whole shtick is just to insult and demean people, should engage, organize vigorous counter-programming, denounce the invitation, criticize the speakers, the student groups, as a way of answering their own attempts to defend the invitation. But and to try to do this in a kind of empowering way, not in a way that will treat members of our community as hugely vulnerable people who need to be protected.
Mhm.
Because I don't think that does them a service. They're going to have to go out into a broader world where it's tough out there, and there's
Right.
a lot of invective and
Right.
derogatory speech. And again, we come back to the online context.
Which is interesting that they're fully aware of it because they live in the world.
Yeah.
It's not like they've
It's
been
their
sheltered
world.
and suddenly
Yeah.
they're going to be let out when they graduate and walk out of Sproul Plaza and
Yeah.
suddenly there's the real world. The real world is very much here.
Yeah.
The question is whether the university is a better version of the real world, a kind
Yeah.
of model for society how to operate,
Yeah.
or whether it's supposed to be this intensified metaphor of the marketplace of
Yeah.
ideas.
Yeah.
We actually have more ideas than in the public park.
Yeah.
And I always struggle with
Yeah.
this because a lot of people
Yeah.
say, no, you're in the university, you should have more ideas. And I actually
Yeah.
think, no, we have fewer ideas we talk about.
No.
We don't talk about any. I don't
It's
go
true, yeah.
online and just Google
Yeah.
Spinoza and read the
We
first
don't
five.
spend time talking about conspiracy theories that have no basis in fact or evidence.
And a lot of people do.
Yeah, and a lot of people do. So again, I come back to the curated speech zone. I mean, what's the point of a university, a physical space where people come together to engage in real time
Right.
discourse and debate with each other if there aren't ground rules that ensure that it's going to be constructive, valuable debate that where people have an opportunity to respond thoughtfully to things other people
You
say.
spent a lot of last year sort of on this commission and really, trying to think through what are the issues for a very, very large and
Yeah.
diverse community. This is a hard question. Do you think ultimately Berkeley is better for it for having gone through this, or if you could sort of roll back time and say, no, actually they didn't decide to come to Berkeley. They obviously came to capitalize on the free speech movement. They wanted to come to a place where free speech really mattered. They didn't choose other universities as their symbolic victories to speak here.
Yeah.
It's already a victory to speak here, no matter what you said, no matter how much you were shouted down. As soon as you spoke at Berkeley, you legitimated in a certain way. They know that. But if you said they didn't come, nothing happened last year, we went through a regular academic year, would you think the university would be better off, the same? we live in
That's a good question,
we're
yeah.
teachers, so we always think
Yeah.
everything is a teachable
Right.
moment. But
Yeah.
I think sometimes also
Yeah.
in teaching something fails, and sometimes
Yeah.
you think this didn't go well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it was very fraught in some sense, but I think that's just something that goes with being such a prominent university that is associated with the free speech movement in the contemporary political environment. We are going to be a lightning rod, and we're going to attract controversy. That makes the place interesting in some ways. I don't think Milo's Free Speech Week, it was just a publicity stunt, in fact. If you want my opinion about it, his reputation as a free speech warrior had been discredited after it emerged that he...
Which is also really interesting because the tolerance of his support group
Yeah.
has a direct limit. He hit
Yeah.
a wall and then something was revealed and boom, they dropped him.
Yeah,
So in
they
some ways,
dropped
all
him
of this
like
great tolerance for all
That's
these
right.
opinions is
No,
completely,
It was...
to use your word, seems hypocritical to me to advance
Yeah.
somebody, where you can say anything as offensive and
Yeah.
virulent and horrible as we can
Yeah.
imagine, but then he says another thing and suddenly he's dropped
Right.
for something he said.
Yes.
So
That was hilarious. in a
speech
way.
tolerance is completely out the window
That's
as soon
right.
as you cross a line in another way.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's right. And that was the background, and he was trying to rehabilitate his career by getting some free publicity and coming to Berkeley again. The event had no value. It was unserious of the students
Right.
to invite him. They couldn't articulate a rationale for inviting him apart from invoking the First Amendment, which isn't a reason to invite someone. It's a
Right, exactly.
it's a
There's also a
principle that permits them.
responsibility not to abuse it, maybe,
Exactly.
right?
Yes.
Right.
So the event itself wasn't valuable, and and it was very disruptive for the campus. There was a massive police presence. It was scary. It was hard. You couldn't walk across Sproul Plaza. And so those parts of it were not valuable. Having said that, we went through it, and it did provoke. You treat things, as you said, like teachable moments at a university.
Right.
And our commission was part of a set of discussions that were set in motion by those events that I think have helped us to become more reflective about what a healthy free speech regime looks like on the campus, and to be a little more articulate about the special responsibilities that students have as members of groups when they're extending invitations. I'd like to see how it would work to implement the recommendation that students groups are free to invite whomever they want, but they owe the rest of us an explanation of why they're inviting particularly controversial speakers, and an account of how they're going to sponsor the events
Right.
consistently with principles of community and our commitment to an inclusive, egalitarian community. We're not, as you said, we're not going to vet those invitations based on their statements, but I think the very exercise of giving an account of yourself to the rest of the community might impose some discipline and lead to a modest elevation in the quality of the discourse.
And what you're expecting is the members of the community to have a sense of responsibility that is not just a matter of sort of treating people with kid gloves and saying,
Yeah.
We're going to offend you, we can't do that, but to actually say what you're doing is so massively disruptive for the purpose of the university that no matter how much you want to provoke people just to think about something else, this doesn't outweigh
Yeah.
the kind of put the disruption to what we're trying to do here.
Well, I think the fact that speech might provoke disruption, especially if the disruption comes from off-campus forces, that was what it was about. It wasn't. I don't think anyone was worried that our students were going to riot when
Right.
Milo was on campus. But there's these Antifa,
Right.
Black Bloc protesters, and so on. But the fact that there might be some anarchist forces who will be disruptive if you invite someone to campus is not a reason not to support the invitation. But if we're going to invite someone who's potentially going to cause disruption, it should be someone who has a place in a university community. That is to say, who isn't going to just get up there and insult people,
Right.
but is going to engage in discourse that is thoughtful, is meant to provoke.
In this debate or something.
And is debate geared to exchange and dialogue.
And to go back to where I started, that you're just enrolling 7,500
Yeah.
roughly new freshmen.
Yeah.
That I actually think what I found really interesting and kind of touching and important and powerful, how much people care about this generation and what they hear
Yeah.
and what they think.
Yeah.
It is not irrelevant, and
Yeah.
in a funny way, when you said earlier, the university is kind of under attack, and there's a lot of disparagement of the university as
Yeah.
a kind of institution that shouldn't be trusted, too
Yeah.
liberal. At the same time, people care incredibly much,
Yes.
which is also, I think, a bit of a startling realization for
Mm.
people in,
Yeah.
no offense intended, in humanities departments or something who we think are pretty much utterly irrelevant, and suddenly society is
Everyone
obsessed
cares.
with who teaches history 101,
Right.
or what's on the syllabus of an English department, introductory seminar in the second semester, and you think what is at stake is actually what value society has, what the next generation is going to believe, and I think a lot of it is also that there is a battle for this next generation.
Yeah.
In your report, you kind of cite the sort of opinion polls of what the students think, and I think it's quite interesting that actually that the students cannot just be given a kind of boilerplate sentence. The First Amendment is good for you; it's always been good for you.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, the Mario Savio tradition. Say this was in the best interests of our nation's highest principles.
Yeah.
And now they're saying, really?
Yeah.
You have these clowns coming, and
Right.
they're defending our highest principles? It doesn't sound like that to me.
Yeah.
They're denigrating me, they're denigrating my friends, they're actually racist, xenophobe, misogynist, these people are not what we want to uphold.
Right.
So I think this is actually a debate about a generation's values, much deeper than they have no tolerance or something. This is about what our country is committed to, really.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really important part of the background, and I do think the university should be locations for robust debate across a wide spectrum of ideological and political views. Another of our recommendations is that the campus should sponsor high profile events that bring in, and there have been some of these events, high profile conservatives.
Yeah, I walk through the hallway. You have posters here sort of across the aisle, like from two sides of the political spectrum. But these are respectable people.
Yeah,
You've invited people,
that's the thing.
very conservative speakers with very liberal speakers to debate. Yeah.
That's right, but that's fine. I mean, that's the kind of debate we want. We don't want conservative, self-promoting performance artists.
I think this is what people have said to me a lot of times. So who are you to draw the line to call somebody a performance artist and somebody else respectable? And you say, well, that's my profession. Yeah. That's why I have training, and that's what I do.
And our judgments about these things are fallible, as everyone's are.
Right.
So again, that's why we're not calling for the university to just set up a tribunal that will decide whether an invited speaker is really going to contribute valuable speech if they're invited to campus. We're just calling on people to start to be reflective about the kinds of value of the speech that they're trying to promote and sponsor on campus, and to give an account of themselves, to engage in a kind of meta discussion about not just about
and to the best of their abilities.
To their best of their abilities.
So they're learning, so they can explore things.
Tell us why you're inviting Milo if you insist that it's important to bring him to campus, and it's not going to be an adequate justification to just cite the First Amendment.
Right.
What is his life experience that makes him an important perspective? I think this is a further aspect of the culture, the broader culture, that has to do with the trajectory of the Republican Party. That's my own personal diagnosis. That makes this a little bit difficult because so many contemporary conservatives are not really interested in good faith debate. They're interested in trolling the liberals, basically. And the student, conservative
I think
groups.
it's a large debate we have in this country right now is, when they go low, Michelle Obama recommended we go high. She spoke from a very specific position of who she is and how she's been trolled for 8 years straight. Yeah. And so in some ways, I think she wasn't saying it as a kind of abstraction. Everybody should. Right. And what you're saying is, well, if they keep on going low, your high ground doesn't really register because actually what plays on the internet is sensationalism, sharp rebuttals, very quick. Yeah. So in some ways we can see that right now. So this discourse. Right. I want to thank you for taking the time. If I can borrow the title from your book, this is The View from Here, which I actually love as a title because I know The View from Nowhere, of course, one of my colleagues. Yes. The View from Here, which is the University of California campus at Berkeley. So Professor Wallace, really thank you for taking the time and sort of walking me through some of the things that have occupied your year. What are you teaching in the fall semester?
It's interesting you should mention that because my one course this fall is a workshop in the law school with Josh Cohen, who's a political philosopher. And our topic is free speech in the era of social media.
Really?
And it's kind of run loosely on the model of the NYU workshop, Berkeley Philosophy, where we invite prominent philosophers and legal theorists to campus every week to discuss work in progress on this issue.
So it's between law and philosophy, or kind of
and political science. Those are the disciplines. We have an interesting lineup: Erwin Chemerinsky, Robert Post from Yale Law School.
Yes.
We have Tim Wu from Columbia, who's
Yes.
written very interestingly on
And
the
the
attention
internet.
merchants, and several very distinguished philosophers, Shauna Schifrin, Tim Scanlon, Susan
Oh, wow.
Bryson. It's a good lineup.
Okay, that's a great line.
And it's directly on this issue.
So the issue isn't letting you go, actually.
No, I thought it would be an interesting thing to
Perfect, yeah.
follow up on. And again, it's weirdly one of our further recommendations in the report is that there should be more,
Yeah.
curricular activities on campus about free speech and its value and its meaning. And I think Josh and I were both particularly interested in thinking about the pressures that are put on some of the conventional approaches to free speech in the United States by social media.
Well, you have a lot to talk about since the biggest platforms, hosting platforms, internet companies,
Yes.
have suddenly discovered that they're private companies and they can do all sorts of
Exactly.
things, and no one
Yeah.
can cry First Amendment, and the Supreme
Right.
Court is not going to turn and look at this and
Right.
resolve this.
Yeah.
And I think the fact that this is even a realization
Yeah.
makes it very important you're teaching such a class,
Yeah.
that people actually understand that
Yes.
what these differences are. And the
Yeah.
second thing is, what is the power of these platforms and media companies
Yeah.
if they've become the public forum,
Exactly. Yeah.
which used to be newspapers, publishing companies, and universities.
Right. Yep. That's absolutely right. Josh is affiliated with Berkeley now and has a long, distinguished academic career, but he's actually employed now by Apple University.
Interesting.
So he's got an inside perspective on this.
Well, so if I may contact you again in a couple of months, I'd love to
Okay.
hear. I'd love to hear what you discovered. Maybe you have a solution for all
Well,
of
I don't
this.
know if I'll have a solution, but it'll be a lot of fun to talk about
Great.
it with people.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
thank you again for
Yeah, well,
joining
thank
me
you
today.
very much. It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay.